What's up, everyone? Welcome to episode 99 of Conflicts of Interest. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anslone, and joining me today is one of my absolute favorite guests and people to talk to, Patrick MacFarlane of the Weekly Liberty podcast from the Libertarian Institute. How you doing, Pat?
I'm doing good, Kyle. Thanks for having me on again, bud.
Good to talk to you today, and gonna use some of your lawyer expertise today. We've been talking a lot of China today, but we've had some big, trial stuff going on in the U.S. with the Chauvin trial. We just got the announcement today, guilty on all three counts. I think if people had placed bets last night, that's not exactly where most of the money would have wound up, but we'll break it down and talk about it on today's show, along with finding out that Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick not only wasn't beaten with a fire extinguisher or sprayed in the face with bear mace, but he had two strokes and died of natural causes. So a lot of interesting stuff and narratives to take apart on today's show. Be sure to share the show. Find the video versions at YouTube and at Odyssey. I know Pat's really been working to blow up his weekly Liberty Odyssey channel. So while you're subscribing to the Conflicts of Interest one, be sure to go to the Liberty Weekly one, subscribe as well. Up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Been doing a lot of social media work on Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter, so check out those accounts. And of course, support the show by supporting the sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com has been with the show pretty much since the very beginning. We're almost 100 episodes in now. I appreciate the support I've gotten from Carlos and Vanessa Oblar so much. They run such a great product company over there selling great products at PalomaVerdeStore.com. So be sure to go and check out their website. Help support a great libertarian, help support a good small company, help support the show. PalomaVerdeStore.com. Get your CBD. Just use the promo code PEACE when you check out to get yourself a discount. Now, Pat, let's talk about this Chauvin trial. I guess let's just start at the beginning, I guess. And I know neither of us sat and watched the entire trial. I did watch and read some breakdowns from the beginning with the selection of the jury pool all the way to to the end with the closing arguments, and read some articles, looked at some analysis, both from people who thought the guy was absolutely guilty and people who were skeptical. I will say that through the course of the trial, I was less sure about my Chauvin being guilty, but I think overall that for me the video does the work. But what were your thoughts on the like overall? Another thing I'll say is I thought that they did a good job in Minneapolis with the trial. The video equipment worked a huge percent of the time for a government institution. You could usually hear the people on microphone who were talking, and like you had a general sense of what was going on in the courtroom, where I feel like a lot of times in things like that you feel like you're only getting a very small chunk of what's going on. So I will also mention that, but Pat, go ahead.
Well, they probably had a lot of time to practice. Knowing them, I went to law school in the Twin Cities, and I was a public defender. I clerked in the public defender's office in Ramsey County, which is St. Paul, and Anoka County, which is about kind of north of the cities. So, but I think they've been remote for quite some time, so it seems like they should have. I guess it wasn't as publicized as this, so they've had some time to figure it out. But I was really surprised by the verdict. I was watching it on my phone on the way home from work, and I was shocked. Like, we were talking before the verdict came out that we both really expected him to be acquitted on the first two counts and maybe convicted on the last count. But if I was a betting man, I would have bet that he was not guilty on all counts. And from what I've seen, from what I've heard, and I didn't follow it religiously, but it really seemed like there was reasonable doubt. I don't know how the state could prove that he intended to kill. And aside from that, the evidence that I heard, and again, I don't agree with this, I'm a libertarian, but the evidence that I heard was that he was following police procedure. And maybe you can correct me on that if I'm wrong, Kyle.
So this question is really complicated. At least, according to the experts at the trial, for me and you, in treating a human being like a human being and police having no more authority than the rest of us, like that's not appropriate. But looking at, was this guy trained to do it, because that's, I guess, supposed to matter under the law and everything like that. I believe his own police chief or police captain said that after Floyd became unresponsive, then that technique was inappropriate. And then, but the defense was able to bring some evidence and some expert testimony. That's what it's called, expert testimony, to show that what Chauvin was doing was within the realm of his training. There's a nice slide that they have of like the Minneapolis police training where it looks like they were trained to do what they did to Floyd. That doesn't make it right, but it does
Right.
change the circumstances some, especially when you're talking about what you're expecting the results to be from the American court of law, which is more of a ritual like kind of thing than I think really an effort to obtain justice. When you talk about like the complexities of what's going on here, so much of the importance of like the trial and the justice process happens in jury selection before an argument is even made, right? Like you said you did some public defender work. How important would it be to like pit the right jury, whether you're the defender or the prosecutor? And then once you look at your jury, isn't that who you're trying to convince? And it doesn't matter what Kyle and Pat think, who are only on the internet. I suppose that one thing I guess I have to hand the prosecutor, who I would say one of the reasons I thought he wasn't going to be convicted of second degree murder was because I thought the prosecutor didn't do a great job in a couple of places. And I thought maybe that those discrepancies and those issues would cause the jury to like try to pick a lesser charge or something like that. And so I'll let you talk about the jury stuff though.
Yeah, well, jury selection is immensely important. When I was law clerking, most of what I did was like bail bond arguments. So I was in the courtroom and stuff, but I didn't really get into any trial work or anything like that. But that being said, I've done a couple small claims trials, but I was a plaintiff's personal injury attorney, so I would do that. But I can tell you just from that jury selection is immensely important. You start trying your case during jury selection, if not earlier. But in jury selection, what you're really trying to do, well, even before that, you try and pick your venue, and you can't really do that in this case. Um, in a criminal defense case, usually it's the county where the offense happened. Sometimes, for some circumstances, you can make a motion to change venue. Usually, they don't like to do that in a criminal trial because it's supposed to be a trial by the people. It's supposed to be the people of the county where it happened. That gets into some Lysander Spooner stuff. But yeah, it is important, and you can strike people from the jury, but the point of the jury is having it be a random selection of people from the venue where the offense happened. So, um, as an attorney, the things you kind of think of is when you start jury selection, you want to make the jury like you, because, and you kind of got into this, Kyle, is that, and I want to talk more about this, but justice, I mean, John Hasness has a very famous piece called The Myth of the Rule of Law. And essentially what he says in it is that the rule of law, this idea that there's some objective law out there, it is completely a myth, because you'll hear people say, oh, well, I don't like the law, but I'll follow it because it's the law. That the law is something that is lofty and on high and set and objective, when it's really not. I mean, it's shades of gray. You can have two different people make two completely different arguments that have different conclusions, and they would both be right. And a good example of this is a jury. You could have 500 different juries, and you would get lots and lots of different results.
Right.
And so the jury is not, so much of it is not whether the evidence presented to them actually, proves the case beyond a reasonable doubt. A lot of it is just, do they like the attorney? What do they think about politics? How do they process their own information? What's their worldview? What's their understanding? So one tweet that I put out today after the verdict came in, and I just want to pull it up here so I get it right. was whether the Chauvin verdicts came back guilty or not guilty, they were never going to be based on the weight of the evidence. And that is because of the publicity of this trial. You could not pay me enough to be one of those jurors. What do you think, Kyle?
No, I do agree with you on that. And one thing that, people seem to be resting so much about, like, the soul of the nation is on these 12 people. Nobody knows who these 12 people are, but man, do I not want to be one of them, because
Yes.
it would be such an awkward position to be in, because I mean, I think even before the Maxine Waters statement, I think there were a lot of people who at least, quote unquote, knew that there would be riots if Chauvin was found not guilty. And so there's so much of that baked into this case. Also, this is a case where, from everybody's perspective, you know about it. Nobody going into 2021 didn't know who Derek Chauvin and George Floyd were. I guess even in most towns, maybe you could like find a jury pool of people who don't know like the murderer and the murder victim and stuff, but there was no way that was going to happen in 2021. So that's kind of a crazy part to this whole trial. And I believe I was looking at something beforehand, and I think 8 of the people were pretty sure that Chauvin was guilty. 8 of the jurors, and like 4 had given ambiguous answers. So yeah, that plays a whole big role into it. And one of the things I tried to remind myself when I was watching the trial was, he's not trying to convince me that Chauvin is guilty. He's trying to convince whoever on the jury isn't already convinced. Not even the whole jury, I think. I think he was just focused on those people. One of the things that caused a lot of dispute was whether the knee was on the neck or the back. That got a lot of attention and play. One of the things that I had read from a couple medical experts was it really didn't matter, that the issue is you're compressing the chest cavity, and so as people breathe they could like open it less and less and less every time, and so that's why George Floyd slowly dies like he does under the pressure of the back. Although I will say I thought the prosecutor kind of built up the argument to make it sound like it had to be on the neck, and so I could see how people got that part of it twisted, but I don't know medically if it actually makes a difference. One of the other big things to happen in the trial was the fentanyl issue, and if George Floyd overdosed on fentanyl, and I guess what role Chauvin having his knee on Floyd's back played in his death. Now, Pat, I understand there's like a law concept called but for, so you would be guilty of somebody's murder if but for your actions they would have lived, right? And so in this case, would they have just had to prove that Chauvin's actions, even if Floyd did ingest fentanyl, contributed to his death, even if he partially died from an overdose?
Yeah, in this gets into causation is the issue that it's called, and usually it's an element of an offense. So you go through law school, you learn that you have to make a prima facie case, which is proving certain elements. And one element, would be intention to kill. It's different for each charge. One would be intention to kill, one would be the actual death, one would be causation. I'm just pulling this off my head here, so don't hold me to the actual elements of what the second degree murder charge is in Minnesota. But it could be a but for cause. That's a little more strict. There's other tests though. There's like the substantial factor test, which is another test that says, you could be guilty if your actions were a substantial factor in bringing about this situation. So, I mean, it could be that, George Floyd had overdosed on fentanyl. Um, I guess the but for test might also work there with but for Chauvin putting his knee on George Floyd's neck, then George, he wouldn't have died even if he had overdosed on fentanyl.
Yeah.
But the one thing I wanted to hone in on, Kyle, is the burden of proof. And the burden of proof is on the prosecution. The prosecution has to prove every element of their case um, beyond a reasonable doubt. And beyond a reasonable doubt means that you have to prove your case, but not only do you have to prove your case, you have to disprove the defense's case. You have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. So a reasonable person couldn't doubt what the verdict is. And frankly, I just don't. Of course, I wasn't in that courtroom and I didn't hear it all, but I just don't see how the prosecution could have proven second degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Did you see anything, Kyle, that would suggest that Chauvin intended to kill George Floyd?
I thought there was something unintentional attached to the second degree murder. It was like second degree murder unintentional somehow. So I think that was a part of the charge. But
Okay.
yeah, because I think when the judge was reading all the charges, they had like it was a careless intent for George Floyd's life. That was a big part of all the charges. So in that case, I do think they proved it. I think a key part of even the fentanyl piece was that there was either it was a fireman EMT or like a just an EMT. I believe that was off duty but on scene and had tried to provide or asked to provide aid to Floyd and they were refused. And so, it seems like if there were ways to do this for Floyd didn't have to die, and that was I think how they essentially proved it. I will say that the prosecution I think or the defense was facing a huge uphill battle, and with what they were able to do during the trial, bringing to light the fentanyl piece. I'm not sure if the jury, I should have looked to clarify this, if the jury got to hear that one of the people in the car with Floyd, I believe, was a drug dealer that had sold Floyd fentanyl in the past. And so I think part of what the defense was trying to do wasn't trying to say it was Floyd's fault that he died, it was the drug dealer's fault that he died. And I thought that was an interesting tactic to take. I thought from because you're trying to tell a story, right? And you can't make the victim of the story the bad guy in your story that you're trying to tell, right? To keep Chauvin out of prison. So I thought that was an interesting part to the trial. There was another thing that I saw people really keyed on, and while it doesn't matter to me as far as the murder trial goes, but apparently George Floyd called his girlfriend like Mona or Momo. And so there was some question about whether if he was crying out for his mother who had been dead for a couple years or his girlfriend who was in the car. I mean, either way, it's sad and tragic and probably just the noises the guy was making as the life drained out of him. But at the same time, maybe that's something people should take recognition of, because there's people who are still out there saying that he cried for his mother, and you should try to get your part of the narrative right too, and that may not be the case. And I think that was a point the defense made that I thought was interesting, because I think it was the first time that the defense really took on something that was established in the media as true and then turned out not to be true in this case.
I pulled up unintentional second degree murder here just on the Minnesota statutes. So subdivision 2, it's 609.19 sub 2, unintentional murders. Whoever does either of the following is guilty of unintentional murder in the second degree and may be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 40 years. Sub 2 of 2 says causes the death of a human being without intent to affect the death of any person, while intentionally inflicting or attempting to inflict bodily harm upon the victim when the perpetrator is restrained under an order for protection and the victim is a person designated to receive protection under the order. Okay. I don't know if this applies. Sorry about that, but
One of the interesting things, Pat, to bring up here as we're trying to puzzle this out is, imagine if you're a juror in this case and there's 3 different charges against this guy, and you probably have 2 different attorney, the defense and prosecution trying to frame it and define them in slightly different ways. And you don't get I don't think, can they go back and listen to like the whole, I mean, they only were deliberating for 11 hours, so obviously they didn't, but it must be pretty difficult to like navigate this as a juror. You know why? Like, it has to be the most boring part of the case too, right? Like, you have people up there crying on the stand. You have these experts coming in and telling you about, different fentanyl levels and different kinds of hold, and medical examiners giving you different interpretations. But then on top of it, everything else, you had to know that 23 B subsection 2 says that if it's this thing, it's a little different than that thing. And man, it just, it has to be, it makes it so that it doesn't seem like this is really a justice system at all, even though, in this case, I do think Chauvin should be in jail. So,
Yeah, and you know, jurors are not. I'm not a big fan of juries personally. I There's several reasons, but it's just because, in some ways you want a layman to kind of use their own faculties to evaluate the evidence and apply the law. And they don't always make the right decision. They're unpredictable. They view evidence in the wrong way. They misapply the law all the time because they're not educated. And there's no way to know because the jury is, they deliberate by themselves. And yeah, they can view certain pieces of evidence. So they take evidence back there with them. I don't know if they can, I don't think that they can replay certain parts of the trial, but they get to view the evidence. There's a book of all the exhibits. So sorry, I might have quoted I was pretty sure that was the right statute, but I'm almost positive. And this is another thing in law school is that criminal law, they have you study like murder to a great degree, even though like only 3% of lawyers who graduate will ever be involved in a murder case ever.
right.
So it's not something that you really spend a lot of time doing. So I don't know the elements for sure, but the second degree usually involves malice aforethought. So that would be an intent to cause serious bodily harm.
Right. Well, I mean, that's one of the things too, Pat, where if maybe it was simpler where they were just talking about did he murder him or not, it would be much easier for a lay jury to figure it out. But, when you have all these, second degree unintentional and then, manslaughter, third degree, and then what's the difference between all of these? It adds a lot of very complicating factors to the whole trial. Another thing I was going to mention is I watch a lot of like the Innocent Project documentaries, and there's like confession tapes on Netflix and a couple other pretty good shows about like how juries or people are wrongfully convicted. And I don't know how many times at the end, the jury will say they convicted, not because the prosecution proved the case, because the defense failed to present a counter narrative. And so she's like, well, I don't know, but they didn't say anything else, so I just assume. And that's not the way it's supposed to work, but that's the way people think. And so that's just that always gets me is that even though the system explicitly says innocent proven guilty, reasonable doubt, people still say prove to me you're innocent or else we're going to convict you.
Well, I think you said something really, really insightful earlier was that the video is what did it. And I think I saw during the prosecution's closing argument, they played the video from start to finish. And I mean, that'll do it. That will do it. There's some things that, you win the case just based off of the way it looks and your knee-jerk reaction, whether that's by the law or not. That's how you win cases. And if you have something that's a smoking gun like that video that just doesn't sit well, that'll do it. And it could have been that, it could have been the video. I suspect that it was the weight of national pressure and the fact that everyone is liberal in the Twin Cities. I mean, that's probably what did it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the video was pretty powerful, and that could have been enough. I think the testimony of, again, like the police chief or whoever was, his supervisor who said he shouldn't have done it. I felt like that maybe the prosecution went overboard. They had like a young kid up there crying who was a witness, in which, like I'm not against that kid sharing his experience, but did that add anything? I kind of felt like that day watching and paying attention to that stuff, I got a lot of emotional fatigue where like, once like the fifth person comes up there and starts crying, like at some point you get tired of like, you know, people reliving the same. And so I felt like that was a place. I think they called too many experts, and at times the experts maybe didn't even directly disagree with each other, but maybe gave differing information that has been used to exploit, you know, for people, especially online, not in the jury necessarily, but definitely people online. I've seen a lot of like, oh, one expert said this, the other said that. There was an MMA fighter that they called for some weird reason that gave like really bad testimony, and then like it wasn't right. And so I thought that looked really bad. And then there was this one thing that happened right near the end of the trial, and this I think gave me some of the most doubt that Chauvin was going to be convicted, just because I honestly started to think the prosecution was looking sloppy when the Chauvin defense proposed the idea that it was actually the fact that Floyd was held near the tailpipe of the car that caused his asphyxiation, and then the prosecution attempted to enter new evidence to prove that that wasn't true. But Pat, from my understanding, from the way discovery is supposed to work, the prosecution is supposed to turn over all the information. So shouldn't that have been something that was turned over?
Yeah, it should have been. It's not a carte blanche rule, though. There's some things that the prosecution can use to get around it. Um, it's not coming to mind. I know that we talked about this in wrongful convictions class, so I'm sorry, but I know there's a famous federal case that deals with this. Um, if one of the first things that you do when in criminal defense is make a demand for discovery, and that's the prosecution has to give you everything that they have. Well, in some instances, the prosecution, through no fault of their own, doesn't have possession of the evidence. Maybe they haven't discovered it, something like that. So it's not like a catch-all, and it might be one thing that the prosecution argued. I know here that wasn't it the case that the judge told the prosecution that they couldn't ask an expert witness about these oxygen levels or the carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide levels,
Yeah, I think
and
that's
they
what the judge ended up deciding, right?
yeah, well, he said he was going to declare a mistrial, didn't he? And then,
Or
he
he
threatened.
threatened to, yeah.
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 Well, my thought, this is why I thought that they were going to get not guilty verdicts, is because it seemed like the prosecution was trying to get a mistrial. If the judge tells them not to mention something or else it will be a mistrial and they go ahead and do it anyways, maybe they want a mistrial so they can retry the case.
Yeah. That's a good point. Were you thinking, is it like a Brady defense or something like that, that requires the prosecution to hand over all potentially like exculpatory evidence? And I believe I was just on the last show, I talked about this story. The man's name is Crosley Green, who spent 32 years in jail. And in 2018, he actually had his conviction thrown out because the police officers who initially investigated the murder thought that a different person was guilty, and the prosecution didn't turn that note over. And so that got his conviction thrown out. And so I'm guessing that's probably a part of it, right, Brady?
Yeah, you're right. Exactly. Brady is the case. Thanks, Kyle. And I would have failed that final, but so the prosecution can get over it though, and part of it is it has to be exculpatory evidence. So if there's an appeal and Chauvin says that I was due that evidence, Chauvin's going to have to prove that the evidence would have, if he had it, would have made a difference in the end result of his case.
Right. You know, there's a lot of times I feel like judges unfairly rule against people in that case where it seems to me that it would have made a huge difference, and then the judge says it won't. But maybe Chauvin will get some deference being a former cop. So, Pat, anything else on this? I mean, again, I convict him however you want. 15 to 20 years seems pretty appropriate for how Chauvin acted and how he treated Floyd. And then I guess the other thing I'll mention is, this is Chauvin is just a cog in the machine. I think he could have been any cop, right? I think like on a different day, the four cops that are there stand in different positions and act the same way. Maybe one of the cops is a little bit smaller and Floyd doesn't end up dying just because the dude's a little bit lighter or is like kind of lazy and puts his hand on the car or something. But I do think that this is just the way police operate, and that the real change will come when we reform policing. Not putting people in jail like Chauvin doesn't help. I think it'll make cops at least rethink acting that way, even if they it's taught that way. If they say, oh boy, I could go to jail for this, they might not do it. So I don't know. Any thoughts you have?
Yeah, I've been trying to come at this with a nuanced position, because it's really easy to be falling into tribalism and groupthink, and I'm seeing this on Liberty Twitter just a little bit, just in on social media in general. So I've been trying really hard not to think tribalistically and to take a nuanced position. So I mean, just the thing that I want to say is that you know you you can think that Derek Chauvin is a killer cop, but you could think that the prosecution didn't prove their case. Um, or you could think that George Floyd should not have died, but you also could think that he's a criminal and he was in the middle of a criminal act. So you know what I'm trying to get at here? Do you agree or disagree with that?
I mean, I guess on the he was in the middle of a criminal act, I find that to be a little less relevant in this case. Although, for I do think to like kind of just check that there are some people who go way too far on, kind of pretending that like George Floyd was just your average guy. I'm sure that him taking the fentanyl and having a history of drug abuse and living the life of he was involved in like a pretty brutal breaking and entry in his life. Like if you're not involved in those kind of things, you may not end up in the position that he was in. But that doesn't change the fact that Chauvin killed him. But I do agree with the first part that you mentioned, specifically that uh, you could be guilty of a crime and the prosecutor could also not prove that crime. And that creates a lot of problems for our society as a whole, because people who look at the trial say he wasn't proven to be guilty could, I think, find some real issues to point out about the prosecution. And then but at the same time, like, look at the video and I think it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at too is like, no, like George Floyd did not deserve to die. Um, and but at the same time, I'm just disgusted by everything. I'm disgusted by how he's been lionized as some patron saint when I don't think that's what he was.
Literally by
Um,
Nancy Pelosi today. His
yes,
sacrifice.
and thanks for dying.
Right.
It's just, and and I think that Derek Chauvin is a killer cop. I mean, and I'm I'm an anarcho-capitalist libertarian, so I don't support the police at all. But on another hand, I think that, tell me what you think about this, Kyle. The riots that happened over the summer, I am concerned that Black Lives Matter and the left are going to think that all they have to do now is riot and get the verdict that they want.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that way some, but then on the other hand, there's the people on like the cops and the Blue Lives Matter people saying, well, then police just won't do anything at all. And they're kind of trying to make their own threats, like keep convicting our cops. And then next time you're getting
Well,
raped, nobody's going to come. So,
yeah.
I mean, I feel like it kind of goes both ways more than people want to recognize. But it is worth it to mention that no doubt, like what's happening in our culture and our society over the past year had to weigh on the mind of the jurors. And I mean, it is what it is. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. All in all, I mean, I think it's just it's a sickening, kind of disappointing thing that I want no part of on
yeah.
all sides. That's just how I feel.
No, I agree with you. I thought that even if you feel like justice was done here, or at the closest thing that that could happen was done here. I do feel like all the like the celebration and stuff is like just a little bit weird. I don't exactly know why I feel that way. It feels like, if you convict a serial killer and put them behind bars, that's good, but at the same time, I like, is that like clapping and celebration? Like, I don't know if that's the way we react to it. If we're just like, this is like kind of the necessary ugly thing we have to do as a society, take people and lock them in jail for significant periods of time, and we do it. We do what we need to do, and he deserves to be there. But I think you could do that without some of the gloating's a little much. I guess I agree with that part.
Yeah, in just one last thing, I guess. Sorry, I just the selective outrage is so disgusting to me, and I know that on the left they also talk about other minorities that have been killed by the police, but again, this is my same problem I have with civil libertarians, is that they don't care that police have more rights than the rest of us. They just think the cops are racist, and that's why they don't like them. And all the white people that have been killed by cops, all the Asians that have been killed by cops, all the Hispanics, the Latinos that have been killed. I could go on and on. It's all about that black versus white angle, or the black versus blue angle, and that's disgusting, and I don't want any part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to move on, talk about another police officer. This one died, but was not a victim of anything except biology. That's Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who died a couple days after the Capitol protest. And it turns out that his death was unrelated, and that he died of natural causes. This is huge, Pat. We've been 3+ months now of there was a murderous riot at the Capitol, and if you disagreed, Officer Brian Sicknick was thrown in your face, and you were called, a supporter of the Nazi white supremacists that killed him. Turns out he didn't die. It's very interesting that it wasn't only myself that's been right about this the whole time, although I will say I was skeptical from the very beginning. I said, boy, with all the cameras that they had there, isn't it kind of weird that nobody has a video of somebody bashing a cop's head in with a fire extinguisher? So I thought that and a few other things were kind of odd, including the police union representative initially saying that it was potentially he wasn't killed at the Capitol riot and it was something else. So I mean, it seemed predictable. The family all along has been saying that they thought he died of a stroke. And isn't it weird, Pat, that if you say maybe Seth Rich died of something other than a random robbery, they'll say, but his brother, and the whole time you couldn't say, but sitting in his family, that wasn't something you could say. So I'll let you weigh in on this, and just I don't know, what do you think it means that now a huge part of the Capitol riot narrative, an event that's been compared to 9/11, that initially they were trying to pass Patriot Act style laws on the coattails of, that the key part of that narrative is now gone?
Well, it doesn't matter. And I think it doesn't matter because this is an example of how the headlines get published, but the retraction or the correction does not, or it doesn't get featured. And I will say that with the caveat that, yeah, okay, we're talking about it, and other people have talked about it a bit. But do you think it's coincidence that this drops very near when the verdict was expected in the Chauvin trial?
That is a good point, because they dropped the Afghan bounty stuff in the past couple of weeks too, and I mean
Right?
that's an even better example of it. You had tons of people in the mainstream media, I think most famously and belligerently Rachel Maddow, screaming that they knew that the Russians paid bounties to the Taliban to murder American soldiers, and Donald Trump was refusing to do anything about it, and we have to ask why. And that straight up wasn't true. It wasn't true at the time. I'm just some guy on my laptop. Early days of the show, me and Will Porter were on here saying it's not true, that this is coming through Afghan intelligence, that the NSA is assessing it with low confidence. And now, apparently, it's just out in the mainstream media and anybody could report it, even though, me and Will knew this. And you still had sitting Senator Tammy Duckworth tweeting every single day for months, it's been X number of days and Donald Trump still hasn't done anything. And do Maddow and Duckworth now spend the next 4 months going back through and saying, like, yeah, we got that wrong. We need to make sure everybody in our audience knows that we accuse the president of treason. We accuse Russians of paying bounties to the Taliban. We accuse Taliban of targeting and murdering Americans because the Russians paid them, and none of it was true. No, they don't even bother
Right.
addressing it.
That didn't stop the sanctions, right? I mean, the this justification just kind of blew away. But correct me if I'm wrong, that the sanctions and this confrontational rhetoric continues.
Right. And in fact, the latest round of sanctions they announced actually included the Russian bounty thing as a possible reason, or as, one of the reasons for the sanctions, when they apparently know in the Biden administration, the intelligence community is saying they assess it with low confidence, which may sound like, oh, I have low confidence that something means I probably believe it's true. In intelligence community speak, low confidence means that it isn't proven distrue, but they don't have they don't believe it. In fact, I think it means that the evidence supports a different conclusion. Moderate confidence would means, they're just in the middle. There's some evidence, it could prove it, it could prove something else. High confidence would mean, we have evidence and it actually points to the conclusion that we're drawing. So you gotta break that down sometimes. But back to Sicknick here, Pat. So, one interesting thing that's been happening is there's 200 something people that have been arrested and indicted. And almost all of those indictments have talked about the murder at the Capitol and that being a part of why these people are so dangerous and why we have to, bring these people to justice and why they can't get bail. There's a huge number of them in solitary confinement. In fact, on the last show, I talked about 5 of them are banned from using the internet. One of them, I guess, actually requested, hoping that would actually keep her out of jail. But 5 people have been banned from the internet or social media that were Capitol rioters. And again, in a lot of these indictments, they cite that Sicknick was killed. And so, just let's say that you're one of these people's defense representative. What changes now that that didn't happen? Is that something you could use as leverage to help your client? Or, and then from the prosecution side, isn't it like kind of embarrassing that you have to take out like the most scurrilous detail of your indictment?
Potentially, I'd have to look at exactly what the charge is and what the elements of the charge are. But you've heard of the felony murder rule, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like one of these. I don't know what degree it is exactly, but the whole idea being that if someone dies while you're in the commission of a dangerous felony, you can be charged with their murder. And so it seems to me like that would take away, if you're being charged with felony murder for the Capitol riots, because of the nature that you were there and someone died while you were there, ostensibly committing, a dangerous felony. Um, I don't know. I mean, it could be the charges could just be dismissed as that the complaint. You might be able to challenge the complaint in like a preliminary hearing or something. Um, just kind of setting out the fact that's something that forms the basis of the complaint turned out not to be true. So I would think that there's motions you could make against that.
I see what you mean. Like the defense could file motions and try to use that to dismiss charges. Um, Yeah, so that was a big part of it that I was thinking is, again, I know that's named in a lot of the indictments. But one of the things that I think is so important about this to take note of is I, was not pushing this narrative a lot, but I was mentioning that, we don't know why Sitnitz died and we should be careful to jump to conclusions. And because of the way this has been reported, I'm skeptical of that's the case. And I got smeared as a racist Trump supporter, like constantly by anybody who disagreed with me. You're just trying to cover for the racist Trump supporters, and it was an absolute true narrative that I was saying. And it's one of those things where I probably would have been a lot louder about it if it wasn't such hot button issue, and I didn't want to, stake my entire reputation on the thing, because I really just didn't know. It just didn't seem true, was all. And how much that like plays an impact on us. That they could just form these narratives, and we all have to accept their truth because it's repeated on every major news outlet, even if we don't know that's the case. And there's no like retribution, or nobody's like nobody who's called me a racist has like messaged me to be like, hey, I was wrong about that thing, sorry, that was my whole basis for slandering you on the internet. You got it right, I got it wrong, man, I should probably like pay more attention to what you're saying. You must have like some way of figuring out what's going to happen.
Well, I think we were talking about in our last episode how the Chinese Uyghur genocide issue. It's a safe position to take to accuse China of genocide for some reason. Again, accusing someone of being a racist is a very safe position to take. You don't have to know much about what happened. You don't have to make any nuanced argument. You can just play that card, and there you go. You're advocating for something that's completely safe and not dangerous, and you can feel justified.
Yeah, I've heard some people kick around the term like post truth, that we're kind of living in a post truth reality where it doesn't necessarily matter. The narrative matters more. People are more attached to the narrative than the truth, and if the truth doesn't fit in the narrative, then it doesn't really matter at best, and at worst, we are supposed to ignore it. I mean, like, people will have accused me of being a Trump supporter simply for saying things that are true. And when I'm like, well, it's true that Obama carried out a lot of drone strikes. Like, I didn't press the button that blew up the little kid, but Obama did order that thing that happened, and he did with my tax dollars and my name. So I'm pretty disgusted about it. And they kind of almost give you that, well, you really shouldn't say that because that helps Trump. And so I really think we're like verging on that era. And I have an idea for a show and some guests lined up to really talk about that in detail. But I want your thoughts on that.
Well, in some way, I think we've always been in a post-truth era because I people think in terms of narratives, and this to tie it all together with the Derek Chauvin trial. As a trial attorney, it's often said that the attorney who tells the best story is the one who wins. And I think that's because people think in narratives. We think in stories. We learn in stories. We pass down history in stories, at least, before writing. A good example is Beowulf. It's all was in oral tradition. So I do think that we've always been in some way a post-truth society. Think about all the ways that we've been lied into war. Remember the Maine, the Lusitania, Pearl Harbor. You can go on and on. But I think the difference being is that now we're coming to the point where it's apparent because we can do our own research and we can read our own things instead of, sifting through the library, which would be the only place where you would find any of this information just 20 or 30 years ago. So now maybe this is the white pill. The other end of it is that it's always been a post-truth era, but at least now we know about it. So, who was it that said, it's the unknowns that are scary.
I don't know. I'm not
Well,
familiar with that quote.
I thought that it was like or it was Donald Rumsfeld, or George Bush,
Oh,
or
that sounds
some
about
neo.
right.
But now we know what the unknowns are. So I think we're in a better position than not knowing what the unknowns are.
I mean, that is true. Like, as much as like they do memory hold things in the mainstream media, Twitter is like forever. Like, your tweets out there, Biden saying in 2012 the troops were coming home from Afghanistan in 2014. Like, that trends when he says the troops are coming home in 9/11, because it's like, what gives, dude? That was 7 years ago. You said those troops were coming home. You've been lying to me for a long time. I'm not gonna believe this anymore. And so that is really helpful, and that's a nice white pill to end the show. Pat, thanks so much for being the guest on show number 99, and being a part of the show so much for the first 100 episodes. So tell people where they can find your work, where to support you, and everybody go and subscribe to both the Conflicts of Interest and the Liberty Weekly channel on Odyssey.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I always enjoy being on with you, and it's a great honor to be on for episode 99. So everyone can find me at libertyweekly.net. That's kind of your one-stop shop. I've really been pushing Odyssey exclusive content that you can only find there. So that'd be at libertyweekly.net/Odyssey, ODYSEE. Otherwise, check me out at the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org alongside Kyle Ancelone and other fine podcasts. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Pat.